Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. I have a Halloween themed spinner shaker card to share with you today. Now, I really like to make Halloween cards, and I also really like to make these spinner shaker cards. So I had a lot of fun making this one. Now, it has been a little while since I've made one of these spinner shaker cards. I took a pretty long break from my channel. As you know, I came back last week, so I'm a little rusty still, and I think that this kind of card is a really great way to get back into it. I might make a mistake or two, but that's okay. Jennifer McGuire actually messaged me a day or two ago and told me she was working on a spinner card video, and that just made me really in the mood to make one of these. And because Halloween is coming up, I thought, why not make a spinner shaker Halloween card? While I've been talking, I'm sure you've noticed I've been doing some Distress Oxide ink blending. I have a piece of Canson watercolor paper cut to 7 by 7, and I have it taped down to my surface. And I'm using the colors Carved Pumpkin, Seedless Preserves, Wilted Violet, and Black Soot. Once that was blended and had a good amount of time to dry, I went over the panel with a powder tool because I'm going to be doing some embossing. Now, when I say a good amount of time to dry, I really mean a really good amount of time because Distress Oxide ink is very sticky and embossing powder will stick to it. I put the panel in my MISTI tool and I made sure to take out the foam insert so that I could stamp with a rubber stamp. And I stamped the spider web background from Simon Says Stamp with VersaFine ONYX black ink. VersaFine is a pigment ink, and pigment inks stay wet for a really long time, so you can emboss with them. So while this ink was still wet, I went over it with a clear, sparkly embossing powder, and when I heat that up, because it's clear, you can see the black through that, and so you get this really pretty, sparkly black embossing. I trimmed the edges off of that background so that it's 5.5 by 5.5, and then I moved on to stamping my ghost images for the card. These little ghosts come from the Mama Elephant stamp set called Little Boo Agenda. I love all of the little agenda stamp sets from Mama Elephant. I kind of collect them. I'm missing a few, but I have quite a few of them. They are so cute. Not only do I like them for cards, but I also use them in my planners. I think that they are really great stamps for planners. So I stamped these with Gina K Designs Jet Black Amalgam ink onto some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock, and I'm coloring them with my Copic markers. I do have the marker caps off to the side in case you want to know the colors that I'm using. This coloring does take some time because there are quite a few of these little ghosts. So I'm going to turn on some music so you can just relax and enjoy the coloring. Or if you prefer, you can feel free to skip to the end. Once the coloring was done, I ran all of those ghosts through my scan and cut so that I could cut them all out really quickly. Then I moved on to creating the spinner element for my card. I pulled out the Hero Arts nested circle die set to cut a whole bunch of circles for the spinner. I started by cutting these 2 rings using the 3 3/4 inches circle die, as well as the 3-inch die. I just used a regular white cardstock for these. These actually aren't really going to be seen, but I did do some ink blending on them to kind of match the background in case they are seen behind the spinner from an angle. Next, I cut out another ring. For this one, I used the 3 3/4 inch circle die, as well as the 2 1/4 inch circle die. I blended on this ring with the Distress Oxide inks, but for the blending on this ring, it does have to be a little bit better than the blending on the other 2 rings because unlike the other 2 rings, this ring is going to be seen. So I did try to match the blending on this ring to the blending on the background for the card. Once that blending was done, I am going to stamp on it with the spiderweb background stamp to make it match that background even more. And in order to kind of line it up with the background, I placed the stamp in my MISTI tool and I placed my background on top of the stamp. And then I placed the ring upside down onto the background in the center. And then I added some tape to the back and I closed the back of my MISTI up onto it to pick it up. And that way I can stamp it kind of where it needs to be stamped with the black ink. Now, I could have embossed that black ink to make it look even more like the background, but I think that it was good enough with just the black ink. And honestly, I didn't want to wait for the Distress Oxide ink to dry. I was kind of impatient, so I didn't do embossing on that piece. Here I have the 2 rings that I first created, the very first ones that I showed. These are actually glued together to make them thicker. And then I glued them to the front of the card in the center. I kind of eyeballed it, but it doesn't have to be perfect. Next, I have a really thin piece of doubled up foam tape, and I took the backing off of it so that I could easily curve it around the edge of this circle. And I'm just going to follow that ring as a guide and place this. Has anybody else noticed that this 3M foam tape has changed, or did I just get a bad batch of it? Because I feel like it isn't as good as it used to be. Let me know down in the comments what you think. Once I got that stuck on there, I cut out another ring. This one I cut out of some plastic packaging that I found in my house. You could use a thicker acetate. It just needs to be thick enough that it's sturdy for the spinner and thin enough that you can actually run it through your die cutting machine and have it cut. To make that plastic ring, I used a 4.5 inch circle die and a 3 1/4 inch circle die. I do think that the inner circle on it would have been better if it was a little bit smaller. If I were to make this card again, I would probably use a 3-inch circle die instead. I placed that plastic ring so that it's going around the foam tape, and then I filled up the shaker area with some different embellishments. I used some pewter and clear star embellishments, and I also used ebony jewels from Lucy's cards. Next, I took the last ring that I made. This is the one that I made to look like the front of the card, so it has the spiderweb stamped on the front of it. I glued some acetate to the back of this one with some liquid adhesive because this is going to be my shaker window. Once the glue was dry on that acetate, I very, very carefully lined this ring up with that foam tape as well as the background on the card. I find it best to do this while standing and looking directly over it to get it as lined up as possible. The stamping isn't going to be completely lined up because I did kind of guess where to stamp the spiderweb on the ring, but it is pretty close and it's kind of hard to tell that it isn't lined up perfectly once we place all of the ghosts. Speaking of those ghosts, I did place them all around the ring and figured out exactly where I wanted them to go, and then I glued each of them down with a little bit of liquid adhesive. You do have to be very careful when you're adhering those little ghosts so that none of the adhesive oozes out of the side and sticks to the background, causing the spinner to possibly stick to the background. Right here, I'm cutting the Boo and Shadow word die from CZ Design out of some white and black cardstock, and then I'm going to adhere them together with some liquid adhesive. I don't think that this die is in stock right now, but you could instead use an alphabet die set to do something like this, or an alphabet stamp set, or you could take another one of the ghost images that you colored in and use that in place of the Boo sentiment. I am doing a second sentiment on this card. This one is from the Itty Bitty Boos stamp set from My Favorite Things. I stamped it with Versamark ink onto some black cardstock, and I embossed it with a white embossing powder, and then I just cut it down into a little strip. I created a 6x6 card base, and I adhered a piece of black cardstock to the front of it, and then I used foam tape to pop up my spinner background onto that card base. I added tiny strips of foam tape behind the Boo sentiment as well as the Ghostly Greetings strip, and I popped them both up onto the center of the shaker. And I just feel like that Ghostly Greetings sentiment just works perfectly with the Boo sentiment. Next, I took out some black sequins and I added them across my card. And this is actually where I created one of the biggest mistakes, and you can see that I'm a little bit rusty with my card making because I added some of those sequins to the outside of the spinner, and they're actually in the path of the spinner, and that is a no-no with spinner cards. Luckily, I realized this pretty quickly. You can see here when I realized it, and I quickly took those sequins off. Now, I did have the paper mess up a little bit with the orange side, so I will show you later how I fixed that. Now, because I removed those sequins, I decided to add a couple more embellishments. I just added a couple of those ebony jewels from Lucy's cards, and then I took a white gel pen and I added some highlights and details to the ghosts. I'm going to show you now how I fixed my mistake. It is a little bit scary while you're doing it because it seems like you're totally messing up this card, which you are almost done making, which is kind of terrifying, and it looks pretty terrible right now. So I grabbed my sanding eraser and I sanded down the area that was messed up, and that's pretty scary to do because when you sand it, it gets this little white spot on it and it looks really messed up. And when you've got a really complicated card like this, messing up at the very end of it is very scary. But it's okay because we do end up fixing it. Once I sanded the paper down and was as happy as I could be with the results, I grabbed the carved pumpkin blending tool again, and I just went over that area as best as I could and filled it in as much as possible. And then I grabbed a cloth and I wiped off the embossing areas, and it looks pretty good. You can barely tell that I made a mistake there. If you're really looking for it, you can see it, but I think for the most part, it looks pretty good. To finish up the card, I grabbed my glitter brush and I went over the Ghostly Greetings sentiment, and then this card was all done. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you really enjoyed this card design and that you learned something. I hope that it gave you some inspiration and ideas for your own cards and that you'll give some of these techniques a try. All of the products that I used are going to be linked down below. I hope you have a wonderful day today, and I'll see you next time.